basic approach to this has been that there are really two intertwined crises that are represented by the situation in Puerto Rico right now. One is an immediate financial and budgetary crisis that has led the Puerto Rico government to actually default already twice on some bond payments, but not to the point where the bondholders are demanding immediate restructuring of their debt. And the other is a much more long-term situation, which is decades now of economic stagnation in Puerto Rico that can be directly traced to the colonial situation which the island has been under for 117, going on 118 years. That while they're related, they are actually distinct, and there's a problem that one requires an immediate response, and the other requires a response, and not a continued postponement of a response. As I've said, I think Puerto Rico went through three forms of colonialism, or three stages of the colonial experiment that the United States has conducted on the island. The first 50 years was the phase of resource extraction, which was basically turning Puerto Rico into a monocrop sugar economy, exploiting the agricultural workforce, taking out of Puerto Rico the goods that the country was producing. That sort of became untenable following the end of World War II and the rise of the anti-colonial movements around the world. And the United States had to explain away the fact that it had fought for liberty but was holding a colony. So after the United Nations was created, the government came up with this idea of self-government, of autonomy for Puerto Rico that became the personification of which was the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, the Estado Libre Asociado, which basically had a whole new approach to colonialism. One, there was a more social democratic policy for the labor force. There are all kinds of things in the Puerto Rico Constitution that even the U.S. Constitution doesn't have in terms of supposed rights that the people have. They turned back the language because the United States had changed the language of the public schools. Of course, the English had turned it back to Spanish when Muñoz Marín, the Popular Party, really came to power. So they adopted a much more sort of a benign form of colonialism, and now more dependent on cheap labor, industrialization of the island and cheap labor. However, that began to run out of steam after a few decades. And by the 70s, you got the period of what's now been this constant stagnation of the economy. So what the government, the U.S. government, came up with in conjunction with the local Puerto Rican elites was in 1976 they devised this thing called the 936 tax credit, which was an effort to get lure American companies to come to the island for cheap, not only for cheap labor, which they had been doing since the 40s, but now for complete tax benefits, a complete tax exemption. So you had an explosion of factories that developed, especially pharmaceutical factories and medical equipment companies, all kinds of companies that depended heavily on R&D and could exploit their intellectual property to get huge profits, and that's complicated, but I can explain to you for those of you who are interested. But basically, what then happened was in '96, the Clinton administration was trying to get reelected, and they needed to raise the federal minimum wage in the United States. So they needed the support of the Republicans in Congress, who at that time were being pretty much run by Newt Gingrich and the right-wing revolution of the Republicans. So Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton cut a deal, which is that Gingrich would support a rise in the minimum wage in the United States, but in exchange, the Republicans wanted about $7 billion in tax credits for small businesses in the United States that would be affected by the rise in the minimum wage. So what happened is Clinton, because there were balanced budget requirements, Clinton had to come up with $7 billion, and it just so happened that about $7 billion was the value of the tax exemptions that the 936 corporations in Puerto Rico were receiving. So in essence, the Clinton administration traded the Puerto Rico tax credits to 936 corporations in exchange for a deal to raise the minimum wage and for him to get reelected. So what happened is they made a deal that the 936 credits would be phased out over 10 years. So it started in 96, and it was gradually 20% a year, 20% a year, 20%, until they came to 2006. And by 2006, the entire tax credits were gone. All the companies fled. So the best manufacturing jobs in Puerto Rico of the stage 2 of colonialism suddenly fled when there were no longer the tax benefits. So then from that point on, from 2006 on, if you look at all the reports, they all date the plummeting of the Puerto Rico economy since 2006. And the government, faced with the fact that it could no longer pay for the social contract that it had established under Commonwealth with its labor force, then began not only cutting, but it also began to borrow to be able to stay, to meet a budget deficit. So you had the explosion of debt that has occurred largely since the early 2000s, where the debt of Puerto Rico pretty much like tripled, I call this the new, I call it uber colonialism or total financial control of Puerto Rico's economy. The first was agricultural resource extraction. The second was industrialization. The third was finance capital, completely running the island through debt. And that's what we're in right now. So basically, that's what's happened. The budgetary crisis is only the latest manifestation, but it is distinct from the trajectory of constant colonialism. Now, what's made it more difficult for the Puerto Rico government, as opposed to the Greek government, which has actually more independence than Puerto Rico does, is that Puerto Rico can't go to the IMF because it's not a country, a recognized country in the international world. So it can't go to the IMF and seek one of those terrible IMF bailouts. The problem has been that Congress has always determined what happens in Puerto Rico, despite the claims of self-government that were made to the United Nations back in the 1950s. Puerto Rico still falls under something that's called the territorial clause of the Constitution. It's a particular portion of the U.S. Constitution which basically says Congress has the right to make all rules and regulations respecting the territories of the United States. And no matter what they may claim Puerto Rico is, it remains a territory, a possession of the United States. And as a result, it's really up to Congress what happens in Puerto Rico on any major issue. So back in 1984, Congress decided that Puerto Rico would no longer be able to use Chapter 9 bankruptcy, even though it had been able to use it for decades before. The law was changed, and many of you have heard about the Jones Act, that requires all shipping in and out of Puerto Rico to be on U.S. flag, U.S. manned, and U.S. built ships, which immediately raises the cost of everything that comes in and out of Puerto Rico. Well, the Jones Act was passed by Congress, that Jones Act, because there was a 17 Jones Act that gave citizenship. The 22 Jones Act was the shipping laws. The Virgin Islands is exempted from the Jones Act by Congress. The Virgin Islands is another U.S. possession, but does not have the Jones Act in effect. So why does the Virgin Islands, a much smaller territorial possession of the United States, exempted from the Jones Act, and Puerto Rico, a much bigger, much more lucrative economy, subjected to the Jones Act? It's purely the decision of Congress. It has no other, nothing else than the fact that Congress feels like doing that and feels that it can do that. One report that I saw said that 1/3 of all the housing in Puerto Rico is empty. Right? I mean, forget about this problem we have here. There are literally thousands and thousands of empty housing units in Puerto Rico because there was an overbuilding during the crisis, before the crisis, the housing crisis, then all the flight of people who have left the island. And so you have an enormous stockpile of empty housing in Puerto Rico, which is driving down the prices of everyone else's houses because there's no demand for housing in Puerto Rico. And that's creating a huge asset loss for the general population. So you've got all these problems, and it's a question that this has to be resolved quickly. May 1, Puerto Rico government owes $440 million in the next big debt payment coming up. July 1, they owe $2 billion in a debt payment that's coming up. And there's no money. There's no money for this. So there's no doubt that the government is going to default big time. Not little, it's done 15 million here, 100 million there, but now it's going to have a big time default coming either in May or in July. And the point that I've been making, and why Puerto Rico is America's Greece, the Caribbean's Greece is apt, is that this has the potential to create a huge problem for the entire municipal bond market in the United States. And that's what, it's not just a Puerto Rico problem, it's an American financial industry problem. That's why you get so much coverage in the Wall Street and in the business press on this on a daily basis.